Tonight's stories come from people who experience something they still think about years later. Most of them began as completely ordinary moments until something started feeling wrong. Some encounters become unsettling only after people understand what almost happened. This happened less than a day ago, and I still cannot stop thinking about it. I was alone in an all-night fast food restaurant in a very small town about 30 minutes outside my city. My fiancé and I had driven there together earlier that evening, but he had something he needed to do nearby, so I stayed behind at the restaurant while he was gone. I spent about an hour sitting alone in a booth, journaling and slowly drinking coffee. For context, I had recently started wearing a hijab. The town itself was tiny, the kind of place with multiple churches and barely 2,000 people. It was already dark outside by the time we arrived. At some point, I noticed a car pull into the parking spot directly beside my booth window. The headlights were pointed straight toward me. At first, I ignored it and kept writing. Then, after several minutes, the driver flashed the high beams at me. I looked up because I thought maybe my fiancé had arrived, but it was not his car. So I went back to what I was doing. Looking back now, I honestly think the driver was checking to see how aware I was of my surroundings. A while later, I became aware of a man standing near the counter. At first, nothing about that seemed unusual. He looked like someone waiting for an order. But after I finished writing and finally looked up properly, I realized he was staring directly at me. Not casually watching me. Staring. There was something deeply hostile about the way he looked at me. His expression itself was blank, but his eyes felt angry, almost disgusted. After a few seconds, he turned away. I tried to ignore it and went back to writing because my fiancé was supposed to arrive soon anyway. But the man never left. Instead, he slowly repositioned himself farther across the restaurant where he could still watch me from the corner of my vision. The entire time, I could feel him looking at me. Eventually, I started packing up my things because I wanted to leave as quickly as possible. The moment I began gathering my stuff, he moved toward the small vestibule between the inner and outer doors of the restaurant. I remember throwing away my cup and leftovers while trying not to look directly at him. Then I sat back down briefly to check my phone. When I stood up again, I saw him standing there with his back partially turned toward me, but his head angled enough that he was still watching me. I grabbed my coat and purse. At that exact moment, he stepped outside and positioned himself directly in front of the entrance. Not fully blocking the doors, just enough that I would have needed to squeeze past him closely to leave. That was the moment genuine fear hit me. Instead of walking toward him, I turned around and headed toward the back of the restaurant to hide in the bathroom. While walking away, I noticed him turn his head to follow me. A few minutes later, my fiancé texted me saying he had arrived. I replied that I would be right out. When I left the bathroom, the man was back inside, standing near the doors again. I walked past him without making eye contact. As I entered the vestibule, I could feel him staring at me the entire time. I was so nervous that I actually tried opening the wrong door before finally getting outside. My fiancé had backed his car into a parking spot a short distance away, and parked directly beside his car was the same vehicle that had flashed its headlights at me earlier. I threw my purse into the back seat and climbed into the car as quickly as possible. Before shutting the door, I looked directly at the man for the first time since noticing him. He was already looking straight at me, completely motionless, hands buried in his pockets, watching silently. As we pulled out onto the highway, I looked back toward the restaurant. Even from that distance, I could still tell he was standing there watching our car leave. About a minute later, another vehicle caught up behind us. It stayed extremely close to our bumper for several minutes without passing, close enough that it immediately made me uneasy. Then eventually, it turned off onto another road and disappeared. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe not. But the more I replay the entire situation in my head, the more convinced I am that the man inside the restaurant was waiting to see whether I left alone. And honestly, I think if my fiancé had not been waiting outside for me that night, the situation could have become something much worse. The next story started with someone simply trying to do their job. It was 2015, and I was interning in New York City for a small independent fashion designer. Her studio was inside one of those massive converted warehouse buildings where dozens of artists rented spaces. Painters, photographers, fashion designers, sculptors, that kind of place. The whole building had this weird backrooms feeling to it. Long, dim hallways, flickering fluorescent lights, concrete floors that echoed when you walked. It always smelled faintly like coffee, paint, and old fabric. And because it was Fashion Week, everyone was working insane hours, including me. It was late, really late, probably sometime after midnight. My boss's show was the next day, so I was expected to stay all night finishing alterations. My boss and her stylist were down the hallway in her office, and I was completely alone in the shared workspace sewing at this huge table under fluorescent lights. The entire building had gone quiet. No music, no voices, just the buzzing lights overhead. And then suddenly I heard a man's voice behind me. "Wow, you've been bent over that table all day, huh?" I physically froze. I looked up and saw this man standing in the doorway across from me. I didn't recognize him. He was probably in his late 50s, maybe older. He had this smug little smile on his face, and the kind of eyes that lingered too long when they looked at you. I kind of laughed automatically because I didn't know what else to do. I said, "Yeah, it's Fashion Week. Lots to finish before tomorrow." And he smiled slowly and said, "Oh, wow, so you're a fashion designer?" I immediately went into eager intern mode, because the building was full of really talented creatives. I'd actually met pretty successful people there before, including an Emmy-winning costume designer. So, when he started asking questions about my work, I genuinely thought maybe this was some important industry person. And I said, "Trying to be, I'm still in school, this is my first real internship." And while we were talking, he started moving closer, not dramatically, just slowly enough that I didn't really register it at first. Then he asked if I had a portfolio, and honestly, I was excited someone seemed interested. So I pulled out my phone and started showing him my senior thesis collection. It was inspired by themes of confinement and entanglement, the way fabric wraps around the body, the feeling of being trapped. Some of the pieces had slight BDSM-inspired elements, but it was mostly conceptual fashion stuff. And I remember rambling nervously while showing him the photos. I said something like, "I was thinking about how sheets twist around you when you can't sleep." And that's when the entire vibe changed, because suddenly I realized he wasn't looking at my work at all. He leaned closer over my shoulder and said quietly, "You're really cute. Do you know that?" My stomach dropped instantly. I looked up and his face was right next to mine. Like, way too close. Close enough that I could feel his breath. And before I could even react, he leaned over and kissed my cheek. Not a quick peck. A slow, wet, open-mouthed kiss. I went completely rigid, I remember just freezing. And then he leaned toward my ear and whispered, "I have duct tape in my office. We could have a little fun, if you want." I swear the entire room felt different after that, like all the air had been sucked out of it. I just stared at him because my brain genuinely couldn't process what was happening, and then survival mode kicked in. I immediately started trying to de-escalate, which, unfortunately, I think a lot of women will understand. Instead of yelling or getting angry, I started trying to make him comfortable enough to leave. I said, "No, sorry. I have way too much work to finish tonight." And then, because I was raised to be polite no matter what, I actually said, "Thank you, though," which is insane to think about now. But when you're scared, your brain does weird things, and he just stood there smiling at me, like he was enjoying how uncomfortable I was. Then he said softly, "If you change your mind, I'm down the hall." And finally, he walked away. I sat there for maybe 5 seconds before I completely lost it. My hands were shaking. I started crying immediately, and I ran down the hallway to my boss's office because I was genuinely scared he was going to come back. But honestly, what happened after almost bothered me more. Because when I told my boss and the stylist what happened, they looked at each other like this was somehow partially my fault, and my boss literally said, "Well, you probably shouldn't show that kind of work to strange men, especially the BDSM stuff." I couldn't believe it. Like, somehow me showing conceptual fashion photos had caused a man in his 50s to corner and sexually harass me while I was alone at work. And even now, more than 10 years later, I still remember his face perfectly. That smile, the way he stood too close, the way he seemed completely aware of how unsafe he was making me feel. Sometimes I still wonder how long he'd been watching me before he decided the building was empty enough to approach me. Hours, days, weeks, I'll never know. Sometimes the most frightening people are the ones who make you feel trapped in plain sight. For an entire month, he stood outside my bedroom window and watched me sleep. At least, that's what the security footage showed. I met him during my freshman year of high school when I joined JROTC. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's basically a military leadership program for high school students. We traveled all over Washington, Oregon, and Idaho for competitions, and because we spent so much time together at practices, on buses, and during overnight trips, everyone in the program became really close. That's how I met him. He was a junior and one of the more respected students in the program. He helped me rank up early and eventually made me his assistant during competitions. At first, I appreciated it. He seemed quiet, helpful, maybe a little awkward, but harmless. At least that's what I thought. Then the gifts started showing up. At first it was small things. Candy left on my desk, snacks slipped into my backpack, little notes tucked into my locker. I tried to convince myself he was just being nice, but the notes slowly started becoming more personal. "I wish other people cared about me the way you do." "I saw you walking yesterday. Who were those people with you?" That message especially bothered me because the people he was talking about were children I babysat after school. Then I started noticing him everywhere. Every time I turned around, he was there, standing just outside classrooms, watching from the end of hallways, walking a little too closely behind me after practice. It got to the point where I genuinely felt like I had eyes in the back of my head. Then the poems started. On the surface, they sounded romantic, but underneath, they felt possessive. "You're mine. You were made for me." And somehow, He always seemed to know things about me I'd never told him. Things I needed, things I mentioned once in passing, things I liked. He would leave gifts in my backpack that matched conversations I barely even remembered having. That's when I started getting scared. I told one other girl in the program about it, but I was terrified nobody would believe me. He was well-liked, respected by instructors, and honestly good at acting normal around everyone else. Then we traveled to an overnight competition across town. We slept in classrooms using sleeping bags lined across the floors. Everyone else treated it like a fun trip, but I barely slept at all. Every time I looked up, I'd see him somewhere nearby, watching me from across the room or lingering outside the hallway. The next day, the bus ride home turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments of my life. When we left the school, my phone was charged to around 80%. 15 minutes later, it was dead. Not low. Completely dead. Even worse, my portable charger was dead too. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe not. But in that moment, panic started setting in because I couldn't contact my parents and I had no way home. I didn't drive yet. Most of the students had already left by the time we got back, and against every instinct in my body, I accepted a ride from him. The entire drive home, all I could think was, he knows where I live now. And somehow, that wasn't even the worst part. He lived less than a block away from me. For about a week afterward, things actually seemed normal again. Then he texted me and asked me out. I politely declined. I was already in a relationship, which he obviously knew. That's when things got even stranger. He responded by claiming he had brain cancer and that dating him was his last wish. Obviously, it was complete nonsense. After that, I blocked him everywhere and tried avoiding him as much as possible. But the gifts and notes kept appearing. Only now the tone had changed. If you really cared about me, you'd talk to me. You're hurting me. You belong with me. At that point, I knew this wasn't just some awkward crush anymore. It felt obsessive. Then suddenly, everything stopped. No notes, no gifts, no staring, nothing. For 2 full weeks, I honestly believed it might finally be over. Then one night around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a light tapping sound against my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was my cat trying to get back inside. Still half asleep, I rolled over and looked toward the window. And there was a face staring back at me. I don't think I've ever screamed that hard in my life. I ran straight to my dad's room, hysterically yelling that someone was outside my window. By the time he grabbed a flashlight and checked outside, whoever it was had already disappeared. But deep down, I already knew who it was. The next day, I finally told the JROTC instructors everything. I showed them months' worth of notes and explained how long this had been happening. At first, they seemed unsure if they believed me. Then I found another note in my locker. "You look pretty in your sleep." That sentence still makes me sick to my stomach years later. What terrified me most was the fact that my blinds were always closed. I even clipped my curtains tightly against the wall because I hated gaps in the fabric at night. My bed sat directly beside the window, meaning he would have had to physically open the window, move the blinds aside, and pull the curtains back just to watch me. When I explained that to the instructors, everything changed. They immediately told me to document everything and gather as much evidence as possible. The problem was, we didn't have security cameras around my house. But my neighbor did. When I explained what had been happening, he sat down with me and pulled up the footage from the previous weeks. And there he was, walking up to my house, around 2 in the morning, night after night after night, sometimes leaving around 3 in the morning, sometimes later, for almost an entire month. I still remember the feeling of watching those clips, realizing I hadn't imagined any of it, realizing someone had been standing outside my bedroom window while I slept, almost every single night. Once the investigation started, another girl admitted he'd been creepy toward her too. Then another girl came forward, then another. Eventually, there were several of us. Most of them received gifts, notes, poems, and all of them heard the exact same lie about him having brain cancer. But none of them had him outside their bedroom window at 2 in the morning. That part was only me. Eventually, all of the evidence was handed over to the school and local authorities. One of the girls even planned on suing him because of how badly the situation affected her mentally. And then he disappeared. Completely. No goodbye, no rumors, nothing. I checked local obituaries at one point because a small part of me wondered if maybe he actually had been sick. But there was nothing, no trace of him, no trace of his family, no social media, no records, nothing. 7 years later, I still think about it sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night. That feeling that someone might be watching from outside the window. And honestly, the scariest part isn't even what he did. It's the fact that afterward, he seemed to vanish like he never existed at all. The next story began with someone who thought they could handle dangerous people. When I was younger, I sold drugs. I'm not proud of it. I harmed people. I harmed families. I contributed to a lot of pain in my community, and I fully accept that now. I can't undo what I did back then. All I can do now is be honest about it and try to help other people avoid making the same mistakes. And honestly, one of the biggest reasons I got out of that life was because of a man named Jerry. Especially as a young woman, I knew selling drugs came with risks. But I convinced myself I could avoid most of them by being careful. At first, I only sold to people I already knew personally, people I trusted. But that didn't last long. Customers would tell friends, friends would contact me, and eventually I started selling to people outside my circle because the money was hard to turn down. That's how I met Jerry. At first, he just seemed awkward. He clearly had a crush on me, but it didn't immediately feel threatening. Looking back, though, the red flag started pretty early. Whenever he bought from me, he'd pay extra. Not just for the drugs. He'd tip me. At first, it was small amounts. Then bigger amounts. One day, he randomly asked me what size shoes I wore, and I remember very clearly telling him, "Please do not buy me shoes." I said it directly because I already had this bad feeling about where things were headed. The next time I saw him, he showed up holding a pair of rhinestone high heels. He said, "I already bought them and they don't take returns." I felt cornered into accepting them. And even though I was still pretty naive back then, I understood something important immediately. Gifts like that come with expectations. And what made it worse was the fact that he could ruin my life if he wanted to. At any point, he could report me to the police. That power imbalance was always sitting in the back of my mind. Around that time, I started getting uncomfortable enough that I tried creating distance between us. I always put my phone on silent before going to sleep. One morning I woke up and saw over 20 missed calls. More than 50 unread texts. Every single one was from Jerry. Apparently, he had found out I went to Disneyland with a guy I was dating, and the messages were completely unhinged. Things like, "You are so ungrateful. After everything I've done for you, you're a two-faced bitch." And finally, "You are dead to me. Don't ever contact me again." Now, honestly, part of me was relieved reading that last message because I thought maybe it was over. But another part of me was terrified because how did he even know I went to Disneyland? We hadn't posted anything online. The relationship itself was basically secret at the time. So, the fact that he knew where I'd been genuinely scared me. And the non-stop calls and messages made me realize this wasn't just some awkward customer anymore. Something was seriously wrong. After that, I stopped responding entirely. But then I started seeing him everywhere. One day I was studying alone at the public library. The place was almost empty. And out of all the open seats in the building, Jerry walked in and sat directly across from me. He opened a book and pretended to read, but I could feel him staring at me the entire time. Another day, I walked out of a nail appointment, and he was standing right outside the salon, just waiting. At that point, I was already living with constant anxiety. I kept hearing stories about local dealers getting arrested. Every time I left my house, I wondered if that was going to be the day I got caught. And now, on top of that, I was afraid for my physical safety too. I was stressed all the time, completely exhausted mentally. Even now, after years of therapy, I still think about that period of my life sometimes. Then one afternoon, things got even stranger. I was about to walk into a grocery store when Jerry suddenly appeared beside me, completely out of nowhere. And he asked, "Do you want to hear a poem I wrote about you?" The second he said that, something in my brain just snapped into survival mode. I said, "No, thank you." Then I abandoned my shopping cart right there and ran back to my car. Later that night, I finally told my boyfriend what had been happening. And my boyfriend basically said, "I'll handle it." He brought a few friends with him and confronted Jerry. As far as I know, they didn't physically hurt him. But they scared him enough that he finally left me alone after that. And honestly, by then, I already knew I was done. Completely done. People imagine leaving that lifestyle is this huge dramatic thing. But for me, it actually wasn't. I just told everyone I wasn't selling anymore. Some people were disappointed because they had gotten used to buying from me specifically. But I definitely wasn't the only dealer around. I'm sure they found someone else. I hope they didn't. But realistically, they probably did. I never saw Jerry again after that, and I still don't know what happened to him. But weirdly enough, the entire experience changed the way I think about safety forever. Even now, years later, I avoid situations where I know I can't easily get help. Because once you've had someone quietly insert themselves into your life like that, you never fully forget the feeling. The next story involves someone realizing they were completely trapped. Around the beginning of 2020, during the peak of the lockdowns, I met a man online. At the time, I was 20 years old, lonely, and struggling with problems at home. I grew up in a very sheltered religious household, and because of that, I had almost no real experience with relationships. He lived over 3,000 miles away in another country. At first, he seemed charming. He was funny, intelligent, and made me feel understood in a way nobody else ever had before. Looking back now, the red flags were obvious. He told me he had anger issues. He mentioned being involved in illegal activity in his home country. Sometimes he became paranoid and insisted his parents were not really his parents. But I ignored all of it. I thought I could help him. Over time, the relationship became more intense. What started as online conversations slowly became plans for one of us to move across the world. Eventually, he convinced me to come live with him instead. At the same time, things at home with my parents were getting worse. We fought constantly, and I felt trapped. So in late 2021, I secretly ordered my documents, packed my things, and boarded a flight to meet a man I barely knew. I remember standing in the airport after landing and seriously considering turning around and going home. Then I saw him waiting for me. At first, things felt normal enough, but there were small moments that unsettled me. During the ride back to his town, I fell asleep from exhaustion. When we finally arrived at his house, I overheard his mother downstairs asking him why he had not warned them I was coming. He became angry immediately and insisted he had told them already. The strange part was that he genuinely seemed to believe it. That was the first moment I wondered if something was seriously wrong. Over the next several weeks, I mostly stayed inside his family's house while he worked. Sometimes he would become strangely aggressive over small things. Other times, he would stare into space silently for long periods of time. Then came the nights. He started waking me up at 3 or 4 in the morning to tell me about shadows moving through the house. He claimed he heard voices whispering to him downstairs. Once, he told me there was a woman standing at the foot of the couch watching him sleep. The fear in his eyes felt real. At that point, I realized this was more than stress or anger. Something was happening to him mentally. Despite everything, I stayed. Partly because I loved him. Partly because I was isolated in another country with very little money. Eventually, my family helped both of us return to my home country. For a while, things actually improved. He started therapy. He stopped drinking as heavily. He became calmer, kinder, more stable. Things felt normal enough that we eventually got married. Looking back, that decision still feels surreal to me. For several months, our life together was peaceful. Then something changed again. One night, I noticed him staring at me silently from around the corner of a wall. Not speaking, just watching me. Later that week, I woke up in the middle of the night and found him sitting beside me scrolling through my phone while muttering to himself. When I asked what he was doing, he started accusing me of cheating with a coworker. The next morning, he disappeared for almost an entire day. I watched our bank account drain in real time through dozens of random charges at bars and liquor stores. When he finally returned home that night, he was heavily intoxicated and barely acting like himself. He sat on the couch staring through me while the apartment smelled like cigarettes, alcohol, and weed. Then suddenly, he exploded. He started screaming that I was a liar, a whore, that I had ruined his life. From that point on, everything became terrifying. He barely slept. At night, he would pace through the apartment drunk, ranting to himself for hours while blasting the television at full volume. I started locking my bedroom door because I was genuinely afraid of him. Sometimes I would lie awake listening to him throwing bottles against the walls outside. He became obsessed with paranoid political beliefs and convinced himself he had abandoned some greater purpose by staying with me. By the end, I barely recognized him anymore. The last night I saw him, he came home around 5 in the morning, extremely intoxicated. He dragged me out of bed so hard that I hit the floor. Then he started ranting incoherently about another woman he had been seeing and demanded to take our pet with him when he left. For the first time in the entire relationship, I finally snapped. I told him no. I told him he was unstable and that the pet was staying with me. He stared at me for a long time before calmly threatening to destroy my life if I left him. At that point, I was too exhausted to even cry anymore. I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove away before sunrise. I never lived with him again after that. Months later, the apartment complex contacted me asking where he had gone because nobody had seen him in weeks. I honestly had no answer for them. Since then, I have gone to therapy for PTSD and depression caused by the relationship. And sometimes, when I think back on those years, the strangest part is how gradually everything happened. Because if someone had shown me the ending first, I never would have believed I was looking at the same person. Some stories disappear after a few days. Others stay with people for the rest of their lives. Good night.